The black sand beaches of Guadalcanal stretched endlessly under the morning sun. August 7, 1942, would change everything. What nobody knew that dawn was how a simple metal can would become the symbol of victory. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen gripped the sides of his Higgins boat. Salt spray stung his eyes. The jungle-covered island loomed ahead like a green wall. Behind him, Marines checked their gear one final time. Each man carried identical supplies. 12 cans of food per soldier. Ham and lima beans. Beef hash. Pork and beans. 2 weeks of complete nutrition packed in metal containers. The cans clinked softly as waves rocked the landing craft. This sound would echo through history books for decades to come. 19,000 American Marines prepared to step onto enemy territory. Their boats cut through the gray waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Each vessel carried more than weapons and ammunition. They carried the industrial might of American democracy packaged in standardized containers. In Tokyo, Japanese intelligence officers made a fatal error. Their reports estimated fewer than 2,000 American troops had landed. This miscalculation would cost Japan an empire. More importantly, it revealed fundamental misunderstandings about American military philosophy that would prove decisive. The significance extended far beyond tactical objectives. For 9 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated Pacific waters. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated their tactical brilliance. Singapore had fallen to their ground forces. The Dutch East Indies belonged to Japan. The Philippines had surrendered. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual power over material abundance. Superior training could overcome numerical disadvantage. Fighting spirit mattered more than industrial capacity. Night assault techniques had proven devastating against Chinese and European forces. The warrior ethos defined Japanese military culture since the Meiji Restoration. Guadalcanal represented the completion of Japan's strategic masterpiece. The island controlled sea lanes between America and Australia. Japanese bombers operating from Solomon Islands airfields could reach any Allied base south of the equator. More crucially, Guadalcanal would launch the final phase of Pacific conquest. New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would fall next. Australia would be completely isolated. The Anglo-American alliance would negotiate a compromise peace. Japan would control half the world's oceans. This was the plan that seemed inevitable in July 1942. Japanese engineers had begun airfield construction that month. They calculated this was routine work on an impregnable fortress. Intelligence indicated the nearest American ground forces were thousands of miles away. Allied strategy remained purely defensive since Pearl Harbor. A few thousand laborers and naval troops seemed adequate garrison strength. Even if Americans discovered the airfield's existence, conventional wisdom held they lacked naval strength for major offensive operations. The vast ocean distances appeared insurmountable. American forces had shown no capacity for sustained operations across the Pacific. This assessment reflected deeper cultural assumptions about warfare itself. Japanese strategic thinking emphasized spiritual power as the decisive factor. Superior morale, training, and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages that seemed insurmountable to Western minds. The Russo-Japanese War had proven Asian warriors could defeat European industrial might. Manchuria had demonstrated how disciplined armies could control vast territories. Pearl Harbor had shown that a single decisive blow could paralyze forces many times larger than the attacking formation. Applied to Guadalcanal, this philosophy suggested even major American landings could be repelled by relatively small Japanese forces fighting with superior skill and determination. Japanese officers with Chinese combat experience understood that Western troops lacked psychological preparation for prolonged brutal warfare. European and American armies relied on overwhelming firepower and logistical abundance to compensate for fundamental weaknesses in fighting spirit and tactical flexibility. If Japanese forces could force Americans into close-quarters jungle fighting where industrial advantages became irrelevant, superior Japanese training and morale would inevitably prevail. When first reports of American landings reached Rabaul on August 7th morning, initial Japanese reaction was professional interest, rather than alarm. Lieutenant General Haruo Shihei Akutake commanded the 17th Army. He had expected an American probe somewhere in the Solomon's chain. Intelligence estimates suggested American South Pacific forces totaled perhaps 50,000 men scattered across dozens of islands from Australia to Hawaii. Even a major effort could hardly commit more than 10,000 troops to a single operation. Such a force would operate at the extreme limit of supply lines, vulnerable to concentrated counterattack that had destroyed Allied forces throughout the Pacific theater. Major General Shucho Miyazaki served as Chief of Staff of the 17th Army. He later described the fundamental question dominating Japanese planning. Did the American force that landed August 7th represent the entire enemy commitment to this campaign? Or was it only the spearhead of a larger counteroffensive? If the former, Japanese operations would certainly succeed. If the latter, victory or defeat hung in the balance. This question revealed limits of Japanese intelligence capabilities. It also showed assumptions shaping Japanese strategic thinking. Even the possibility that American forces might sustain major operations across thousands of miles of ocean strained Japanese comprehension of Allied capabilities. The first Marines stepping onto Guadalcanal's beaches encountered landscape designed to fulfill every expectation of Pacific warfare. Dense jungle pressed down to the water's edge. The canopy was so thick that noon sunlight filtered through like twilight. Humid air hung heavy with rotting vegetation scent and exotic flowers. Constant insect buzzing promised weeks of misery from malaria, dengue fever, and dozens of other tropical diseases. The few Japanese defenders retreated into jungle after token resistance. They left behind construction equipment, food supplies, and clear evidence of complete surprise. Even in these first hours, signs emerged that this operation would differ fundamentally from previous Pacific campaigns. Marines securing the unfinished airfield found massive stockpiles of Japanese supplies. Rice, canned goods, construction materials, and fuel represented months of careful preparation. More significantly, they discovered the airfield was far more advanced than intelligence reports indicated. Japanese engineers had graded and partly surfaced a runway capable of handling the largest bombers in American inventory. With minimal additional work, Henderson Field could become a major airbase supporting operations throughout the Solomon's chain. Strategic implications became apparent within hours. From Henderson Field, American aircraft could reach every major Japanese base in the northern Solomons. More crucially, they could interdict supply lines connecting Rabaul with Japanese forces throughout the region. If Henderson Field became operational, Japan's entire defensive perimeter in the Southwest Pacific would be vulnerable to sustained air attack. What had begun as limited operation to deny an airfield to the enemy suddenly became the key to rolling back Japanese conquests throughout the region. Japanese commanders recognized this threat immediately. Their response revealed the same strategic assumptions that shaped their initial underestimation of American capabilities. Rather than rushing major reinforcements to Guadalcanal, Imperial General Headquarters ordered limited counterattacks designed to overwhelm what they assumed was a small American garrison. The first effort was led by Colonel Kiyono Ichiki. His force embodied everything Japanese officers considered most effective about their tactical approach to warfare. Ichiki's 916 men represented the elite of Japanese infantry. Veterans of China campaigns had perfected night assault techniques proven so effective against Chinese and European troops. Their mission was straightforward: land west of the American perimeter, approach through jungle under cover of darkness, destroy American forces in a single coordinated assault. Intelligence estimates suggested fewer than 2,000 Americans held the airfield. Japanese officers calculated that even a force as small as Ichiki's could achieve tactical surprise sufficient to overwhelm such a garrison. Confidence shaping this planning extended beyond mere tactical considerations. Japanese military culture had elevated the night attack to an art form. Officers and enlisted men trained to operate in complete darkness with coordination their enemies found almost supernatural. Chinese armies had repeatedly dissolved under Japanese night assaults. Superior numbers became meaningless in confusion of close-quarters combat, where Japanese training and discipline proved decisive. European colonial forces throughout Southeast Asia had shown themselves completely unprepared for psychological shock of facing enemies who seemed to emerge from darkness itself. They displayed coordination and determination that defied Western understanding of military possibilities. Applied to the Guadalcanal situation, these precedents suggested American Marines would prove as vulnerable to Japanese night tactics as all previous opponents. American forces had shown no particular skill in jungle warfare during brief Pacific campaigns. Their doctrine emphasized daylight operations supported by overwhelming firepower. This suggested psychological unpreparedness for close-quarters night fighting, where Japanese advantages would be most pronounced. Even if American forces detected the Japanese approach, superior numbers would be neutralized by confusion of darkness. Difficulty of coordinating defensive fires in dense jungle terrain would compound American disadvantages. The Battle of Tenaru River on August 21st shattered these assumptions with violence that sent shockwaves through Japanese command structure. Ichiki's carefully planned assault dissolved into slaughter. His men encountered Marines who not only detected their approach, but had prepared interlocking fields of fire that turned the battlefield into a killing ground. American weapons proved devastatingly effective in close quarters, fighting that Japanese doctrine considered its specialty. The new M1 Garand rifle and Browning automatic rifle delivered firepower Japanese forces had never encountered. More shocking still, American forces demonstrated tactical flexibility and night-fighting capability that Japanese intelligence considered impossible for Western troops. The aftermath of Tenaru battle revealed details Japanese officers found almost incomprehensible. American defensive positions showed evidence of systematic planning, suggesting weeks of careful preparation rather than hasty entrenchments typically associated with Western forces. Marine fire discipline had been so effective that Japanese assault formations were destroyed without ever reaching American positions. Most significantly, captured American equipment revealed logistical abundance that defied Japanese understanding of how military forces operated across such vast distances. The sea ration cans that littered American positions became symbols of a military philosophy Japanese observers had never encountered. Each Marine carried 12 cans representing 2 weeks of complete nutrition. Meat, vegetables, fruit, and even cigarettes and chocolate packaged in containers designed to survive months of tropical storage. Japanese rations, by contrast, consisted primarily of rice supplemented by whatever local food could be obtained through foraging or requisition. The contrast represented more than mere logistical differences. It revealed fundamentally different approaches to sustaining military operations across oceanic distances. Japanese supply doctrine had evolved from centuries of warfare on the Asian mainland, where armies typically lived off the land or established supply bases within controlled territories. Vast Pacific distances had forced some adaptations, but Japanese planners still assumed successful operations depended primarily on speed and tactical efficiency rather than sustained logistical support. Troops were expected to carry minimal supplies and supplement rations through capture of enemy supplies or local procurement. This approach had proven successful throughout Southeast Asian campaigns, where Japanese forces consistently outmaneuvered Allied armies tied down by massive supply trains and extensive logistical requirements. American supply doctrine represented the opposite approach. Systematic application of industrial capacity ensured combat forces never lacked anything necessary for sustained operations. Each Marine on Guadalcanal represented not just an individual fighting man, but the culmination of a supply chain stretching back 6,000 miles to American factories, farms, and training camps. Sea rations were produced in plants designed specifically for military requirements. Ships built for that purpose carried them across the Pacific. Distribution occurred through logistic systems that treated supply as the foundation, rather than afterthought, of military operations. This contrast became more pronounced as the Guadalcanal campaign extended beyond the few weeks Japanese planners had expected. American supplies continued arriving with mechanical regularity. Naval battles caused occasional delays, but never fundamentally interrupted the flow. Japanese forces found themselves increasingly isolated from their supply bases. Tokyo Express runs bringing Japanese reinforcements to Guadalcanal could deliver troops and ammunition. They lacked capacity for bulk food supplies necessary to sustain large forces indefinitely. Destroyers and fast cruisers could carry soldiers. Rice and other staples required cargo vessels that proved too vulnerable to American air attacks from Henderson Field. By October 1942, General Hyakutake arrived on Guadalcanal to personally direct what he expected would be the final assault against Henderson Field. Japanese forces faced a crisis no amount of tactical skill could resolve. Intelligence estimates finally acknowledged American strength on the island exceeded 20,000 men. Hyakutake's greatest challenge was not enemy numbers, but the logistical reality of sustaining his own forces. Japanese troops were already on reduced rations. They supplemented dwindling rice supplies with captured American food and whatever edible plants they could find in the jungle. Disease had begun taking a toll that exceeded combat casualties. Malnutrition weakened soldiers' resistance to malaria, dysentery, and dozens of other tropical ailments that made Guadalcanal a pestilence even for healthy men. The Japanese offensive of October 23rd through 26th represented the climactic test of competing philosophies that had shaped the entire campaign. Hyakutake committed nearly every available man and weapon to a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm Henderson Field through sheer determination and tactical excellence. The plan called for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The main effort would be delivered by elite troops who had spent weeks infiltrating through jungle to reach positions south of the American perimeter. Supporting attacks would pin American reserves while naval gunfire neutralized the airfield and prevented American aircraft from interfering with the ground assault. If successful, the operation would not only recapture Guadalcanal, but demonstrate that Japanese fighting spirit remained superior to American material advantages. 3 days of battle that followed proved instead that American forces had evolved far beyond the defensive-minded troops who had absorbed initial Japanese victories of 1942. Marines manning positions along what became known as Bloody Ridge fought with tenacity that matched anything Japanese forces could deliver. They were supported by firepower and coordination that Japanese tactical doctrine had never encountered. Artillery directed by forward observers provided continuous support, that broke up Japanese assault formations before they could close with American positions. Aircraft operating from Henderson Field delivered close air support with precision that turned daylight movement into suicide for Japanese forces. Most critically, American logistics enabled sustained defensive operations that gradually exhausted Japanese assault capabilities. The symbolic power of the sea ration can become most apparent during these desperate October battles. While Japanese soldiers attacked on empty stomachs or with nothing but a handful of rice in their bellies, American Marines fought from positions stocked with cases of food that would have fed a Japanese squad for weeks. This abundance was not merely material luxury, but operational necessity. Well-fed troops could sustain the kind of continuous combat that gradually wore down even the most determined attackers. Japanese forces, already weakened by months of inadequate nutrition, found their legendary endurance failing at the critical moment when tactical success might have compensated for strategic disadvantage. The failure of the October offensive marked the moment when Japanese commanders finally grasped the true nature of the challenge they faced. This was not merely a larger version of limited operations they had conducted throughout the Pacific. It was an entirely different kind of warfare based on principles they had never encountered. American forces were not defending Guadalcanal as a temporary foothold to be abandoned if pressure became too intense. Instead, they were establishing a permanent base supported by supply lines that stretched across the entire Pacific and drew upon the industrial capacity of the continental United States. General Kawaguchi, whose September assault had also failed against American positions, provided perhaps the most honest assessment of what Japanese forces confronted. The Americans fight differently than any enemy we have faced. They do not depend on superior courage or tactical innovation to achieve victory. Instead, they systematically apply overwhelming material superiority to gradually destroy enemy capabilities. They fight like a machine rather than like warriors. Our traditional methods are powerless against such systematic approach. This recognition came too late to alter the strategic situation on Guadalcanal. It marked a fundamental shift in Japanese understanding of the Pacific War. The assumption that superior fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage had been tested under optimal conditions. Elite Japanese troops had attacked positions held by Americans at the extreme limit of their supply lines and had failed completely. More troubling still, American capabilities appeared to be increasing rather than diminishing as the campaign progressed. Each month brought new equipment, additional troops, and expanded air operations that suggested resources on a scale Japanese planners had never imagined. The contrast in medical capabilities provided another measure of the systematic advantages that American forces enjoyed. Japanese military medicine remained primitive by Western standards. It emphasized prevention of disease through discipline and physical conditioning rather than treatment of casualties through systematic medical intervention. Japanese soldiers were expected to continue fighting or to die honorably, rather than burden their units with evacuation requirements. Medical supplies consisted primarily of basic field dressings and simple analgesics. Serious cases were evacuated only when tactically feasible. American medical doctrine represented a completely different philosophy. The systematic application of scientific medicine to maintain combat effectiveness through treatment and prevention of casualties. Each Marine unit included trained corpsmen equipped with supplies and techniques that enabled treatment of wounds that would prove fatal without immediate medical intervention. More importantly, American forces had established evacuation procedures that treated wounded men as valuable resources to be preserved rather than unfortunate casualties to be abandoned if necessary. Hospital ships, surgical facilities, and specialized medical personnel represented an investment in human resources that Japanese commanders found difficult to comprehend. By November 1942, This difference in medical philosophy had become strategically significant. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were losing more men to disease than to combat. Malnutrition and tropical conditions created epidemic levels of malaria, dysentery, and other ailments. American forces faced the same environmental challenges but sustained much lower disease casualties through systematic prevention measures, superior nutrition, and immediate treatment of illness before it became debilitating. The result was that American combat effectiveness remained relatively stable, while Japanese capabilities steadily degraded. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November represented Japan's final attempt to apply traditional concepts of decisive naval warfare to a situation that had already moved beyond the realm of tactical solutions. Admiral Yamamoto committed major surface units, including battleships, to a coordinated effort designed to neutralize Henderson Field through naval gunfire while covering the landing of massive reinforcements. The plan embodied everything that Japanese naval doctrine considered most effective: concentration of superior force at the decisive point, coordinated operations between different types of units, the psychological impact of overwhelming firepower applied with perfect timing. The three-day naval battle that resulted proved instead that American naval forces had evolved as dramatically as their ground and air counterparts. Using radar-directed gunfire, coordinated tactical formations, and systematic application of damage control techniques, American ships fought with effectiveness that surprised even their own commanders. More significantly, the battle demonstrated that Henderson Field had become virtually unsinkable through traditional naval bombardment. Even direct hits by battleship shells failed to close the runway for more than a few hours. American engineering units repaired damage with efficiency that suggested months of preparation and unlimited supplies of repair materials. The failure of this final naval effort to neutralize Henderson Field marked the moment when Japanese strategic planning finally acknowledged the reality of American capabilities. Intelligence reports filed in late November admitted that American strength on Guadalcanal exceeded 30,000 men and continued to increase despite Japanese interdiction efforts. More critically, American air operations from Henderson Field had made daylight supply runs to Guadalcanal impossible for Japanese forces. American submarine warfare had begun to seriously degrade Japanese shipping throughout the region. General Imamura's decision in December 1942 to begin planning for the evacuation of Guadalcanal represented more than tactical retreat. It acknowledged that Japan's fundamental strategic assumptions about Pacific warfare had proven incorrect. The campaign had demonstrated that American industrial capacity could sustain military operations across any distance the Pacific Ocean presented. More troubling still, American forces had shown tactical capabilities that matched or exceeded Japanese performance in every category that Japanese doctrine considered decisive. The successful Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February 1943 provided a final demonstration of the systematic advantages that American abundance provided. While Japanese naval forces conducted a brilliantly executed withdrawal that saved thousands of men from capture, the soldiers they evacuated were shadows of the elite troops who had landed on the island 6 months earlier. Months of inadequate nutrition, tropical disease, and continuous combat had reduced proud regiments to collections of sick and wounded men barely capable of walking to the evacuation beaches. American forces who inherited the battlefield found evidence of Japanese suffering that shocked even veteran Marines accustomed to the brutalities of Pacific warfare. Japanese positions contained the remains of soldiers who had died from starvation rather than wounds. Personal equipment revealed desperate attempts to supplement inadequate rations with jungle vegetation, tree bark, and even leather goods boiled into soup. Medical supplies had been exhausted months earlier, leaving Japanese wounded to die from injuries that American corpsmen could have treated routinely. The contrast with American logistical capabilities was stark and undeniable. Marine units that had fought continuously for 6 months remained at nearly full strength. Their losses had been replaced by fresh troops rotated from rear areas. Equipment worn out by jungle conditions had been systematically replaced with improved versions designed specifically for tropical warfare. Most significantly, American supply capabilities appeared to be expanding rather than contracting as the campaign concluded. New airfields, port facilities, and supply depots transformed Guadalcanal from a strategic liability into a major base for future operations. The sea ration can that had symbolized American abundance throughout the campaign became, in Japanese eyes, the emblem of a military philosophy they had never imagined possible. Each American soldier represented not just an individual fighting man, but the culmination of a supply system that treated material abundance as the foundation rather than the luxury of military operations. This systematic approach to warfare rendered traditional concepts of military efficiency obsolete. It created operational capabilities that no amount of tactical skill or fighting spirit could overcome. In Tokyo, the strategic implications of Guadalcanal's loss reverberated through every level of Japanese planning. The campaign had consumed resources equivalent to those required for major operations in China, but without achieving any strategic objectives that compensated for the losses incurred. More critically, it had revealed American capabilities that suggested future operations would face even greater material disadvantages as American production reached full wartime levels. The transformation in Japanese strategic thinking was perhaps most evident in the shift from offensive to defensive planning that characterized Japanese operations after Guadalcanal. The assumption that superior tactics and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage gave way to recognition that American industrial capacity required fundamentally different strategic approaches. Instead of seeking decisive battles where Japanese advantages might prove sufficient, future planning emphasized the construction of fortified positions. These positions were designed to extract maximum cost from American advances while conserving Japanese strength for defense of the home islands. Yet even this shift to defensive strategy could not fully compensate for the lessons that Guadalcanal had taught. American forces had demonstrated not just superior material resources, but the systematic application of those resources to achieve objectives that traditional military thinking considered impossible. The establishment and maintenance of major military operations across thousands of miles of ocean presented new realities. The integration of ground, naval, and air forces into coordinated campaigns showed unprecedented coordination. The sustained replacement of losses over periods measured in years rather than months represented capabilities that no defensive strategy could fully counter. The 6 months of fighting on Guadalcanal had revealed the emergence of a new form of warfare based on industrial democracy rather than warrior aristocracy. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized the cultivation of individual excellence and unit cohesion through years of training and spiritual preparation, American doctrine treated military effectiveness as a product of systematic organization and material abundance. Neither approach was inherently superior, but under the conditions of Pacific warfare, American systematic advantages proved decisive. The Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal carried with them the knowledge that they had faced something unprecedented in military history, an enemy whose strength derived not from superior courage or tactical innovation, but from the systematic application of industrial capacity to military purposes. This recognition would shape every subsequent Japanese operation in the Pacific. Commanders planned defensive strategies based on the assumption that American material advantages would continue to expand indefinitely. The Marines who secured Henderson Field and held it through 6 months of continuous assault had achieved something more significant than tactical victory. They had demonstrated that American democracy could mobilize resources and sustain operations on a scale that rendered traditional concepts of military efficiency obsolete. The C-ration cans that littered their positions after each battle were symbols not merely of logistical abundance. They represented a society that treated the welfare of individual soldiers as a strategic priority worthy of massive industrial investment. In the broader context of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal marked the moment when the conflict's ultimate outcome became mathematically inevitable. Japanese forces had tested their finest troops, most advanced equipment, and most sophisticated tactics against American positions at the extreme limit of Allied supply lines and had failed completely. Future operations would face American forces that were not only numerically superior, but supported by supply systems and industrial capacity that Japan could never hope to match. The strategic revolution that Guadalcanal represented extended far beyond the immediate tactical lessons of jungle warfare and amphibious operations. It demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved beyond the realm of individual or even unit excellence to become a contest between competing industrial systems. In such competition, the society that could most effectively mobilize its productive capacity and sustain operations across unlimited distances would inevitably prevail. This would happen regardless of the tactical skill or fighting spirit displayed by its opponents. The lesson that Japanese generals learned too late at Guadalcanal was that American democracy had discovered how to transform abundance into military power through systematic organization and unlimited commitment to the welfare of individual fighting men. Each C-ration can represent not just a meal, but a philosophy of warfare that treated human resources as too valuable to waste and material resources as too abundant to conserve. Against such systematic advantages, no amount of traditional military virtue could ultimately prevail. In the end, the 6 months that Marines held Henderson Field proved that modern war belonged not to the warriors, but to the engineers, not to the spiritually pure, but to the systematically organized, not to those who could endure the most suffering, but to those who could most effectively prevent suffering through the intelligent application of overwhelming abundance. This recognition would define not only the remainder of the Pacific War, but the entire subsequent evolution of military power in the industrial age. Victory belonged not to the most dedicated fighters, but to the most productive societies. The metal cans that once held ham and lima beans became museum pieces displayed in cases with reverent explanations. Visitors would read about their significance without fully grasping what they represented. These simple containers had announced the arrival of a new kind of warfare, one where industrial capacity mattered more than individual heroism, where systematic organization defeated spiritual preparation, where abundance triumphed over endurance. The echoes of those cans clinking together in Higgins boats would resonate through military history for generations to come. American democracy had learned to package victory in standardized containers and deliver it anywhere in the world that freedom required defense. The lesson would not be forgotten by those who witnessed its power on the black sand beaches of Guadalcanal.